This is the third in a series of 3 Sunday mornings on why a good God should allow evil and suffering. In the first, we looked at the book of Job and why God allows the innocent to suffer. In the second, we looked at what difference it makes whether you believe in God or not. And today we look at the traditional Christian accounts of why God allows evil and suffering. The explanation which dominated Western Christianity for most of its history and is still popular in some places is the one developed by St. Augustine in the 4th century. He argued that God, being perfect, created a perfect world with a perfect Adam and Eve and gave them free will. They used their free will to eat the forbidden fruit. And in that way, sin entered the world. Augustine taught that all suffering is caused either by humans committing sins or by God punishing the sins. Some of his successors taught that so long as all sins get punished, then the world is perfect. That's fine. Today, most people don't find that a very happy conclusion. And there's another problem with Augustine's account. It divided history into stages. First, there was the original perfect state. Then Adam and Eve ate the forbidden fruit. So that was the fall. And then the next stage of history lasted from then until the crucifixion and resurrection of Christ. And now we are in the third stage, which will last until the second coming of Christ. Today, most people think of history as a more gradual thing with change over time, rather than everything being the same and then sudden jumps. And this more gradual sense is what many Christians believed before the time of Augustine. 200 years before Augustine, there was a bishop called Irenaeus who had already offered an account which fits our modern understanding better, and it got revived in the 19th century. According to Irenaeus, when God created humans, we were in our infancy. And like children, we didn't always do the right thing. As we use our freedom, we learn from experience to choose good and reject evil. We make progress day by day and ascend towards God, who is perfect. So Irenaeus said we should just accept that we are part of this long, gradual process. Here's a passage I'd like to read to you. I put it on your handout. Apologies for the 19th century translation, but I think it's really worth reflecting on. This is Irenaeus in the 2nd century. If then thou art God's workmanship, await the hand of thy Maker, which creates everything in due time. In due time, as far as thou art concerned, whose creation is being carried out. Offer to him thy heart in a soft and tractable state, and preserve the form in which the Creator has fashioned thee, having moisture in thyself, lest, becoming hardened, thou lose the impressions of his finger. But by preserving the framework, thou shalt ascend to that which is perfect. That's Irenaeus. If he's right, why does God allow us to suffer from natural events, and why does God allow us to suffer as the result of other people hurting us? Those are the 2 questions that people keep coming back to. So, first, natural events. There's a huge literature about this, and the most common examples quoted are earthquakes and cancer. Why does God allow them? I find it rather odd. We know where the earthquake zones are. In California, they designed their homes to resist earthquakes. In Turkey, the people who live in earthquake zones are poor people with no choice. It doesn't have to be like this. And as for cancer, I've got bad news for you all. You're breathing Liverpool air. That makes you more likely to get cancer. Our society has chosen to pump carcinogens into the air in order to do things it values more highly than clean air. And as long as we're doing that, does it really make sense to blame God? Now, earthquakes and cancer are just two of the examples. We could spend all week thinking of others and talking about them. And when I shut up, you'll have a chance to reflect on that. The other question is why God allows us to suffer as a result of other people doing wrong. 2 weeks ago, we looked at the story of Job and what life would be like if nobody suffered as a result of other people's actions. Morality wouldn't work the way it does now. But did God have to make us suffer quite so much? Couldn't the 20th century have missed out on Hitler and Stalin? Well, this also is much debated, but I would like to draw... I've actually listed a few things that get said on your handout. I'm just going to focus on one of them now. We all try to convince ourselves that we are good people and the evil is done by other people who are not like us. We easily fool ourselves by not noticing the effects of our own actions. Studies have shown that the worst atrocities get committed by pretty normal people. There's a classic study by Hannah Arendt called Eichmann in Jerusalem. Eichmann was one of the Nazis responsible for killing Jews in the gas chambers in the 1930s. He had no personal malice towards them. He even had Jews in his own family. What makes him frightening, Arendt says, is his banality. Here's a quote from Arendt. He merely, to put the matter colloquially, never realized what he was doing. It was sheer thoughtlessness, something by no means identical with stupidity, that predisposed him to become one of the greatest criminals of the period. With the best will in the world, one cannot extract any diabolical or demonic profundity from Eichmann. And then she goes on to say that, in other words, the trouble with Eichmann, quote, was precisely that so many were like him, and that the many were neither perverted nor sadistic, that they were and still are terribly and terrifyingly normal. So, that's the end of the quote. Maybe our inability to understand why other people should be so wicked is partly because we imagine that we ourselves would never have done such things, and maybe we're fooling ourselves. So I'm going to go back to Irenaeus now. If he was more or less right, God created the universe, so over time, gases swirling around space are slowly turning into living, caring, loving beings. And we are part of that process. Referring to Jesus, Irenaeus said that God became what we are so that we may become what God is. Just one more question I'll mention. One of the debates about this is, if that's right, is there any guarantee that evil will eventually come to an end altogether? Has God sewn it up so that we'll get there in the end, or has God left the future open so that it all depends on how people use their free will? The best known 20th century book on why God allows suffering is John Hick's Evil and the God of Love. That was published in the 1960s, and Hick believed that the present evils can only be justified if, in the long run, everybody's suffering will be compensated by an even greater good. And that is one reason why he believes there must be life after death, so as to set the record straight. The alternative point of view was described 100 years ago by a philosophical theologian called F.R. Tennant. He argued that it isn't a question of compensation. The point is that we can become holy like God, and we choose. And that's the justification for it. That's what Hick was disagreeing with that. Well, now, recently, Linda Zagzebski has argued for a position similar to Tennant's, and I'm going to finish with this, and you can then talk about what you think. I was quite impressed by Zagzebski's account. She writes, "Consider the way parents treat their children. A good parent loves her child and wants him to develop into a full person. She also knows that her child's personhood has to be cultivated by giving him the space to grow, and that means gradually giving the child autonomy. The motivation for treating the child in this way need not be that doing so makes the child morally better, nor that autonomy is good, nor that the loving relationship she wants to have with her child is good. Still less need she do it because the overall amount of good in the world will increase if she does so. She does this simply because to love her child is to love a person, and that necessarily requires accepting the necessary condition for personhood, her child's autonomy. Her love for her child is a motive that leads her to do whatever contributes to the development of his personhood, whether or not it leads to good." Linda Zagzebski is suggesting that that is the way God deals with us. So you might like to think whether that makes sense to you or not.